I read every self-improvement book on my book list. And then I didn't make a book list anymore. So, this is the story of how I tried to improve my life by reading all these self-improvement books. Not really only self-improvement, I just basically tried to read all the books I possibly wanted to read that were kind of interesting, that also weren't too difficult, because otherwise you would just sit there and not understand everything if you didn't study this book for 100 hours or 1,000 hours. So it had to be common language. But yeah, so this is what happened. It started in my teenage years, I guess, already, and my parents already had a few books like these. The first book I read was on time management. When it comes to particularly self-improvement, I mean, of course, there are also I also read books on finance and also books about. I mean, as a teenager, not as a teenager, but as a child, you're pretty much interested in anything. There are these big books with images. They are and this is what spies used in the Second World War, and this is how a giraffe looks like, and. So there were these fact books about very different topics, of course, but when I moved into my teenage years, I discovered this book about time management, and I guess also already from my parents' side, they also were I would say pretty efficient with the time, and just randomly watching movies during the week or something like this. But just if we watched a movie also as a family, and it was a very special occasion, I guess. And also in my childhood, we didn't go to the cinema every other day, but it was once a year or twice a year. So it was a very special occasion when we did things like this. So back to time management. There was this book about time, and it was called the C-word method, I guess. And I guess this just had such an impact on me, because it was one of the first books I read, and it was basically like this. So the thread went like this. First, just write down all the things you do. Then take a look at all the things you do. And then try to maybe do things differently if you think it would be better if you did things differently. And that's essentially how it works. So, but this essentially kind of taught me, and this is also something you kind of learn in school and when trying to study for school, is this. You first look at the things that are already there, then you just analyze them. So this is basically also the looking at things, then you try to analyze them, you try to improve them, and then you actually analyze again. Basically you check how it's going, and if it's not going so well, then you try to improve again. So it's basically a very easy improvement cycle. So what I did is, I already had a watch in my teenage years where I was it's this time, and it's this time. So in my teenage years, so already as a child again, I pretty much wore a watch from the time I got to school, because that was the time I had to stand up at a certain amount with that at a certain time in the morning, and also just having the watch on my wrist, I don't know. There are many ways this could theoretically go, but this is about all the books I read about self-management and self-improvement. So, this method of using your time by first analyzing it and then just trying to improve it had such a big impact on me. And then I began to also read other books. So, after school, I was it's not I was in a vacuum. It's just something that was in my mind right now. But in school, you learn the things you have to learn. Of course, the things are interesting, and many of the things are things you otherwise already also would want to know. But the thing is that it's kind of a two-sided connection. I mean, there are two sides of this coin. This is what I'm trying to say. On the one side, these things are very interesting. On the other side, you have to do them. And so, if you already have to do them, then it's basically stoicism by just accepting you already have to be interested in them, and then it just makes sense to be interested in them and to just learn them. But once you let go of this connection, you basically can choose what you're interested in, what you want to do, and the things you want to read. So I began reading. It was already before I did my before I graduated high school, which is not really a term where I live, but it's this level basically of leaving high school. So I began to just read a lot of books. I was like, how about? So before I would say I was pretty decent in school, but apart from the school itself, I just was like, I had this interest in psychology for many years, I guess. So maybe for 1 or 2 years before I started to really get into psychology. But I just feared kind of reading big fingers. I feared reading Sigmund Freud. I feared that I wouldn't understand it, that I would fail to understand it, and that I just would be like, oh yeah, I'm reading this and I'm totally dumb because I don't understand it at all. But once I figured this time management thing out, so I basically started kind of planning my time. So maybe for 2 hours, for example, I had left 2 hours and I was like, yeah, and I could read 20 minutes and then switch the book, another 20 minutes, another different book, and therefore I would have like the same content every single day, and therefore I would remember it better, and therefore I would also look forward to this 20 minutes on this particular topic. And so I was like, how about not just reading 10 books at the same time, but only like 10 to 20 minutes a day? And I started this during preparing for my graduation, basically, not graduation, but for my high school graduation, or the A-levels. It's called the A-levels, I guess, at least in Britain, and in Germany it's called the Abitur. In Austria it's called the Matura, but apart from these countries I don't know how it is called. In the US it's probably called high school graduation. I just wanted to make a joke about graduation and radiation, but it didn't work out in English, so I just laughed. So now, I got into all these different books. I started to read Sigmund Freud. I bought this very chunky thing of Sigmund Freud, and then I bought like The Capital by Karl Marx. Of course, this is like a thing that's associated with socialism and with a lot of deaths in the past century, but I mean, he just wrote a book, and actually, during the end of his life, he just dissociated himself from these ideas, or to how people used his ideas. But I just wanted to read the book, and the book itself was like, it just was an economics book. It was not so much about all the other things. There was like, the book he wrote about economics was this thick, and then there was like this very tiny social manifesto. It's called the Communist Manifesto, I guess, in English, and not the socialist, but the Communist Manifesto. And yeah, so I started to read Karl Marx. I started to read Sigmund Freud. I was like, how about I don't just read books of the Greek? And so I was like, yeah, just read Rhetorics by Aristoteles. And how about just reading like random other things? And so I ordered all these books and I just read them. And I read them. And I read like things about finance, and I read things about... And then I was like, so this was like over the last years. Then I was like, Benjamin Graham, The Intelligent Investor. And then I was like, how about reading something by Tony Robbins, since this seems to be the number one motivational guy in the world. And how about reading something by Tim Ferriss, because he wrote the 4-Hour Workweek. And how about reading this book on climate change that Bill Gates wrote? So this was just some time ago. Eventually, what I found out is that reading in itself is a very inefficient process, because you read it, and for example, I don't quite remember everything I read in Sigmund Freud. Of course, this is an oversimplification, because you, of course, remember a few things, but the thing is, if you read, you actually have, just like in studying, you have to memorize the things, you have to revisit them again and again. This is also already why reading so many books at the same time makes so much sense, because then you memorize the things you read the day before every single day, because and this is because you are like, oh yeah, this connects to the thing I read only yesterday. It's not like, oh yeah, this connects to the thing I read 2 years ago. So I started to read all these different books, and I also started to allow myself to just spend money on books. So this, of course, first happened when I got into like physical books, but then I discovered that you could also just download them onto your e-reader. So I bought an e-reader. This was also already like 10 years ago, I guess, and I also try to sell this ebook reader right now. But the thing is, I eventually discovered all these new things in our head, like all these ideas in my head. And because I flipped between all these books, the connections also between the books came to appear. So there was like this thing Karl Marx wrote, and there was this thing Sigmund Freud wrote. And because I just read them book to book, or how do you say it, back to back, then I was like connecting these things. And this is something the human mind is really good at. And this is something also that makes up basically how good your brain works. The more connections between the things that are in your brain you have, the faster you can think. Of course, thinking fast is not really like made up of these things, but I just used thinking fast as an example for your brain working actually better. And for example, the more languages you have, the more you can connect all the different words, because all the different words, like in French, there's a word for ambulance, and in German there's a word for ambulance, and in English there's a word for ambulance, and there are then some, for example, in Italian it's probably ambulanza, in French it's ambulance. No, that was English. I don't know the French word. And in German it's Krankenwagen, but that's just a joke, I guess. So there's this joke about the German language sounding so harsh, like ambulance, and then Krankenwagen. But the thing is, you start to connect all these different things, and then new ideas come to be. And this is also why I maybe had the idea then to eventually start a blog, because I was like, how about I just write about the ideas, because there are all these thoughts in my head, and I mean, I tried for years to explain them to friends I had, and this sometimes takes hours. Not really takes hours, because it's only you talking, and it's a very selfish thing, so therefore it doesn't really make sense. Of course, only if the other person is interested, but that's a different story. But what I started to realize, reading all these different books, that it's not about this one book. It's about just making it a habit to discover new stuff. And since many of these people in the self-improvement space also try to self-improve themselves, even though self-improvement has kind of a very negative vibe to it, like, yeah, there are these people that like try to self-improve themselves, and they only think about themselves all the time. But it's not about this. It's just about optimizing the things in your life. And since your life is basically the only thing you have, it's about optimizing everything. And optimizing is just, I mean, there are two ways you can theoretically go. You can either try to optimize something, or you try to do the opposite, which is trying to get things worse. And this, of course, is nonsense. Therefore, the optimization is the only thing that makes sense for everything. And to which extent you apply this is just, I mean, it's up to you, I guess. But it just makes sense to try to do the best optimization you can do, because everything else would just be worse than the level you would then be in. So, coming back to time management, coming back to reading all these different books. What time management, for example, taught me about reading all these books is that it's pretty damn inefficient reading the books as a primary time. So I was like, how can I make this differently? So I started to record things, like when studying, I was like, oh, I just record this and then I may listen to it on audio. But the problem was that you had to organize all these files and name all these files. So eventually what I came up with is, so there are different solutions to this problem. For example, you can now have a service that actually you can basically save any web page and it just reads it to you, like in one big chunk of a playlist. Then there also, of course, are podcasts. So once I got into the space of discovering new things, I was just listening to podcasts all day long, and I just tried to implement all the ideas I had. I tried to learn from history. I mean, this is not about like, and then I had this big discovery phase where I improved every part of my life. Of course not. But I am trying to paint an image. I'm trying to tell a story. Of course, story is not how life happens, but story is just the things you pick out that now make sense theoretically, that now at least seem to be a story, an interconnected web throughout the different phases of your life, or throughout the different timestamps. You just take these random events out and then connect them together, like in every other movie or in every other story. So what these books and the idea of self-improvement is basically just an idea that makes sense. It's just a rational idea. It doesn't make sense to try to spend more money, only if it makes sense in a bigger picture, of course. So I don't want to paint an example now. Try to come up with an example for how it could make sense to spend more money on things. But the thing is, there is always something that makes sense. And if you think about it, there is always something that makes sense. And therefore, it just doesn't make sense to try to do the opposite. And that's just mathematics. It's just like there are different things that make up what is the output of a function. And by trying to optimize the input or by trying to optimize the output, you then have to take a look at what actually goes into the function. And this could be the podcast you read. This could be how much sport a week you do. This could be optimizing your nutrition. This could be optimizing which books you read and how many books you read, and maybe decide that sometimes it's not the time to read books, but to actually apply what is in the books. And sometimes this makes more sense. This is called the exploit trade-off, discovering new things versus applying the things you already learned. But as a summary, what all these books kind of taught me is not what all these books kind of taught me, but just the habit of actually discovering new things, being open to new things, even though I often kind of also now think that I probably already kind of can guess what is in this book. So there are a few books out there I wouldn't recommend, like these books that are just aiming into the motivational space, because motivation isn't something that lasts. But a system is something that lasts. So instead of reading something like, oh, get the fuck your life together, I mean, yeah, it's obvious, and therefore I don't have to read a book about it, but I instead could read a book that helps me better understand my brain and therefore optimize it in this way, because this is actually the way you optimize. It's the better way to optimize yourself. It's called systemic thinking instead of trying to do everything with willpower and motivation, which is still a threat that exists in our society. But yeah, it doesn't make the most sense, to say the least. So what did reading all these books teach me? I guess many things, and I already told you all these many things, and I already summarized them 10 times. So I guess this is the end. And have fun reading all these books.